Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and for my photography buying guide that you can get for free right now at sdpcommunity.com, I've spent the last couple of weeks shooting wildlife and sports with the Canon 70D, the brand new camera that promises all the great things that you loved about the 70, including that awesome focusing system at a lower cost. Plus a lot of new video features that I think are really exciting for both sports and wildlife shooters. So I'm going to tell you what I found and what worked and what didn't. And I'm also going to be updating my recommendations because in the past I've been recommending that Canon shooters go for the Canon 7 plus this 400mm lens here as their kind of a mid-range wildlife photography solution, and I've been wondering whether the 70D is going to replace it or not. So I'm going to run down all the details and then give you an update on that. In addition to comparing it to the 7D, I'm going to be comparing the 70D to the 5D Mark III, which a lot of people love for wildlife and sports because of its amazing autofocus system and that incredible low light capability, but has a very high cost. And of course, that full frame sensor loses a lot of detail in the center of the frame for those shots that you have to crop. So there's good and bad about it, but we're going to be going over all of that. So up first, let's talk about the frames per second, because that's really important for these types of cameras. Now, the 70D offers 7 frames per second. The 7 offers 8 frames per second, and the more expensive 5D Mark III only offers 6 frames per second. Now, when you're shooting wildlife or sports or any sort of action photography, you really want to take as many pictures as you can. And the more pictures that you can take, the better your odds are going to be that you get that shot like right when the ball hits the bat or right when the bird's wings are up at the apex of its flap and not blocking its eye. And that also means you'll have to spend less time out in the field because if you want to get that perfect shot and you have, say, 3 frames a second, well, it means you need to wait for 2 runs of the bird. But if you can get to 6 frames a second, twice as many frames, the odds that you'll get that perfect picture in a single run of the bird are a lot better. So the difference between 8 frames a second in the 7 or 7 in the 70D or 6 in the 5D Mark III, well, it's not huge, but it can be substantial, and that 1 extra frame might be the frame that you need to get the shot that you need. So I can't discount any of the cameras for that frames a second, but the 7D definitely wins that battle. While we're on the topic of frames per second, the number of frames per burst is also really important because when you're shooting wildlife or sports or any kind of action, you have your camera in continuous shutter mode, and then you just hold down that shutter button. And it's like, da, 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 and you just try to get as many pictures as you possibly can while the action is going on. But your camera can't do that forever. It's gonna run out of buffer pretty quickly, in a couple of seconds, in fact. And then it starts taking pictures really, really slowly. In fact, let me turn on this 7 over here and we'll see how it does. Now we hear the buffering kick in. And there's nothing more frustrating than running out of buffer and having your camera start to shoot slower and slower, because sometimes what happens is I'll see that bird on the horizon and it's flying towards me and I'll start to shoot, and then just as it gets nice and close and the light is perfect, then the buffer kicks in and it starts shooting dit, 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 and I'm missing my shot, and that's completely maddening. So one of the first things I check when I'm scoping out a camera for wildlife is how many shots it can take in a burst. So let's go over the numbers. Now, there are many different factors in how quickly your camera runs out of buffer. Of course, the number of megapixels and the actual buffer in the camera, and whether you're shooting RAW or JPEG. And if you're shooting JPEG, well, you shouldn't be shooting JPEG, you should be shooting RAW. But just about any camera is going to be able to shoot more than 100 pictures if you're shooting JPEG. So for that reason, some wildlife and sports photographers will resort to shooting JPEG. But at the same time, RAW is so important because you so often have this crazy dynamic range, especially with wildlife, because they might be in the direct sun, and sometimes they'll be both black and white like an osprey, and you want to be able to recover the highlights and show all that feather detail in the burnt out feathers, but you want to also be able to raise the shadows up and reduce the contrast a little bit if you're shooting in the full sun. So full RAW is really important. Now my 5D Mark III will shoot 30 to 33 frames with a high-speed CF card in it before it runs out of buffer. If I put in a low-speed CF card, it only shoots like 13 frames, so it runs out of buffer in a couple of seconds. So I actually had to invest in a pretty expensive card, like a $250 card, one of the faster cards, to get that full 30, 33 pictures in. But it makes a really big difference. That means I can hold down that shutter button for more than 5 seconds. And I find that that's generally enough time to catch an entire run of a bird coming at me, or plenty of time if somebody's rounding the bases or running on the goal in a soccer game. So you don't really run out of buffer with the 5D Mark III, and it really could be a problem with either of the other two cameras. So I put a high-speed CF card in the 7, and I was able to get about 23 shots in before it ran out of buffer. I'll tell you what I have here. I'm using the Lexar Professional 32 gigabyte UDMA 7 card. This is about as fast as a card as I could find. The cards vary in their rated capacities, and you really want to look on the internet to find tests that show exactly how a particular camera body performs with a particular model of CF card or SD card, because some cards are faster with others for whatever reason. Anyway, this one rates well for the 7D and the 5D Mark III. And it gives me about 23 shots before my 7D with the latest firmware upgrade runs out. So 8 frames a second, 23 shots. That means I can shoot for about 3 seconds. That's not nearly as much time as the 5D Mark III. The extra 7 to 10 shots that I get out of the 5D Mark III definitely make a difference. You know what it means? It means when I'm shooting with the 7, I have to wait until that bird gets a little bit closer. I have to be a little more patient. And maybe I shoot in shorter bursts. I'll shoot 4 or 5 pictures and then wait a second, and then shoot 4 or 5 pictures and then wait a second. And while I'm waiting, it can start clearing that buffer and give me some more shots. Now, the first time I shot with the 70D, I ran out of buffer in 12 or 13 shots. That's because I had this really old SD card. All my other cameras use CF cards, so I had this really old SD card that I crammed in there, and it just couldn't clear the buffer fast enough. So I went out and got a really high-end SD card. I ended up getting 19 frames with the faster card and the 70D. Then I tried a medium speed card. That was like the fastest card you can buy. It was one of these extreme deals. So what I did was I went and I got a 128 gigabyte super cheap computer bay SD card. I wanted this for filming video because I often film video for long runs. I didn't plan to use it for wildlife. But while I had it, I went ahead and tested the number of shots in the run, and it was exactly the same. It was about 19 shots. So it didn't seem like I got the benefit out of that really expensive card. And so for that reason, if you're getting the 70D, don't waste your money on the higher end, expensive, fast cards. Instead, I strongly urge you to get this 128 gigabyte computer bay card. It's working great and it will never run out of shots. And with wildlife and sports, that can be a problem. Even with a 32 gig card, you get like a little over 1,000 shots. But I've run out of shots before. And then you're still in the thick of the action and you're trying to go back and delete some shots that you hate, and you're gonna end up missing shots. So that can be a real factor too. So anyway, 128 gigabyte computer bay card. I like it a lot, check it out. So far we've talked about the frames per second and the buffering, and the 7 wins the frames per second. The 5D Mark III wins the buffering. So the 70D is batting 0 here. So far, it's not an ideal camera for either capacity. But let's talk about the focusing systems. The 70 reportedly has exactly the same focusing system as the 70, and the 70 had a remarkable focusing system. 19 autofocus points, all cross-type, and that means you can use any of those focusing points for tracking sports or wildlife. And the 70D does seem to have a great focusing system. In fact, there's something about the 70D's focusing system that I like even more. I don't know, maybe it's just me, though Chelsea reported it too. It seems to have almost a cinematic effect for it. Like I feel like the 7's focusing system jerks into place. And I feel like the 70D's focusing system moves more smoothly. And I don't know if that's a side effect of the optimizations that they did for making video or not. But anyway, I like looking through it. I did extensive testing with the 5D Mark III and the 7 and the 70D, autofocusing on moving subjects. I went out and chased seagulls and eagles and osprey, and they all did great. I wish I could have said, oh, clearly here the 7 is the winner or the 70D is the winner. No. I mean, the 5D Mark III still has the greatest focusing system out of the three of them, but both the 7 and the 70D are extremely capable cameras. So if you're interested in more information about that, check out my wildlife photography equipment video, and also check out the so-called ultimate comparison that I did with the 6D and the 7D and the 5D Mark III and some other Canon cameras for more information about the focusing systems. One more point about the autofocus on the 70D versus the 7. The 70D doesn't have all the same focusing modes of the 7. It's missing that precision AF, and I think they call it spot AF, and it's also missing like the one of the area modes that's supposed to track your subject across the focusing points, and I didn't miss it. I use either a single autofocus point, or I do, if I'm shooting a bird against a blue sky or another plain background, then I'll select the all autofocus points and just let it track, and that's what I've done with the 7D, and that's what I'll do with the 70D, and they're kind of interchangeable. So in other words, they make a big deal out of dropping those features, but I didn't miss them, and I don't think you will either. So now, how about image quality? Now, when we're talking about sports and wildlife, detail is extremely important. And I find, especially with wildlife, that I'm almost always not only at the long end of my telephoto lenses if they're a zoom, but I'm cropping down, because you really can't ever get close enough to wildlife. And I have one of these monster big 500 millimeter lenses, but it doesn't matter. Like, the difference between a 400 or 300 or 500 millimeter lens, well, it's not going to get you too close. You never end up zooming back if you do have a zoom lens. You always end up cropping, always, 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 unless you do setup photography and you're hiding in a blind and you're drawing the birds close to you. And even then, you really have to be at the point where you're like stacking on extension tubes before you're ever filling the frame with wildlife photography. There's this big myth that you should be filling the frame, but it's generally not practical. You almost always end up cropping. So there's a big difference between these cameras. The 5D Mark III is a full frame camera, and that means if you attach one of these lenses, well, it captures the entire image from the sensor, but then later you go back and crop it. Now the 7 and the 70D, they have a smaller sensor, and they capture just the center of the image, and they throw the rest of it away. But they have more megapixels in the center of the image than the 5D Mark III does. Because the 5D Mark III, it's what, 23 megapixels, and the 70 is 20 megapixels. So those 20 megapixels are crammed into like 60% of the space, meaning if you're cropping your picture anyway, you end up getting a lot more megapixels out of either the 7 or the 70D than you do the 5D Mark III. So it's this kind of weird thing where the Mark III definitely has better image quality. Full frame cameras always have better image quality than crop cameras. But if you're cropping, you probably are going to get better image quality out of one of the crop cameras. And this has been a really important factor for me because I make a lot of recommendations for what type of cameras people should get for wildlife and sports photography. And up until now in the Canon world, I've been recommending the 7D because of its crop sensor and its high megapixel count. So the 70D has a little bit higher megapixel count. I needed to do some image quality testing though to see if it had more noise or less noise, or if you could even see the difference between them. So I set up a little test lab here with my favorite animal, this little bear. I wanted to do a real world image quality test, but you know what? Birds don't hold still long enough for you to be swapping out 3 different cameras and to make everything precise. And I know you YouTube people, if the lighting changes a little bit or something, you're complaining over and over again about it. So I wanted to do a really controlled test for you. And I did that with this bear. I also set up a light off camera on it to blow out the highlights in the bear a little bit because that's a common scenario for wildlife. And you'll notice I use this green tree in the background here as the background and threw it out of focus because one of my biggest gripes about wildlife photography with any camera is the amount of noise that you get in blue skies or blurred green trees, because these primary colors, when they're nice and smooth like that, they don't show up nice and smooth when you zoom in because they just have an extremely large amount of noise in them. It just has to do with the way digital sensors are designed. Solid colors of red, blue, and green are always going to have more noise than white or gray or something that fills the entire spectrum with light. So let's jump into Adobe Lightroom and check out those results. Here on the left we have the Mark III, and on the right we have the 70D. And the first point I'd like to make is that the 70D has a crop factor. Therefore, on this 400mm f/5.6 prime lens, my main recommended lens for wildlife, you can see that it gets a lot closer. This bear is much closer to filling the frame than it is on the 5D Mark III, because the Mark III is a full frame camera, and the 70D is just taking the center image. It's exactly as if I cropped this 5D Mark III picture. Now here's why the crop sensor cameras, and the 70D specifically, make a better option than the full frame cameras for wildlife. And the reason is you always end up cropping. Well, at least almost always. Sometimes you can manage to hide well enough to get close to the birds, but for the most part, even with the big, huge lenses, you end up cropping quite a bit. Therefore, what you really care about is the image density in the center of the image. And if we zoom into 1:1 here, we can see that the eye here and all the details here are much larger than they are in the picture taken by the 5D Mark III. You can see that the 70D shows quite a bit more detail. If you look around the eye here and you look at this threading as compared to the Mark III, there's really no question that the 70D shows more detail than the Mark III in a cropped picture. Now it's interesting because the Mark III here, over $3,000, and the 70D about $1,100. So this is close to 3 times more expensive. But for wildlife, the 70D is generally going to get you to show more detail. Now, a related question is whether or not the image quality is better. So we'll have to look into that a little bit more. But at ISO 100 here, I'll zoom into 4:1 so that we can get really close to this background noise. And as we do that, it can be tough to see this in the video, but to my eyes, the Mark III clearly has so much less noise than the 70D does. And that's not the end of the world. That means that you'll have to do some extra processing on the 70D, as I describe in Chapter 8 of Stunning Digital Photography. Now the 70D is here on the left, and the 7 is here on the right. Once again, I'll zoom in all the way to 4:1, line their eyes up. Now the 70D has a few more megapixels than the 7D, but not many. I think the difference is 18 to 20 megapixels. And as you can see, comparing these two, it doesn't really show any more detail. And as I zoom into the green background here, to my eye, the amount of noise is about equivalent. I'll zoom into 4:1. And I can't see any difference, and in fact I showed this to several other people and they can't see any difference. And some standardized tests that are very scientific show that there's really no difference in image quality between the 7D and the 70D. And this is at ISO 100, this is the best case scenario. So to further establish that, I'm going to jump up to ISO 800 here and show you the same two cameras. Zooming into 1:1, we see far more noise at ISO 800 than we did at ISO 100. But once again, the 70D and the 7D seem to have about the same amount of noise. Now I'll jump into the develop module to show you how much you can recover the highlights. In the histogram here, I've turned on the red highlights so that we can see the parts of the picture that are overexposed. And I deliberately overexposed the white part of this bear here because this happens a lot in wildlife. You'll have these black and white birds like osprey or bald eagles, and the white feathers will catch the sun, and either you can expose for the highlights, in which case the rest of the picture will be completely underexposed, or you can shoot raw and push the highlights a little bit so they're intentionally overexposed and then recover them in post. And, you know, as I look at these, the 70D seems to have a little bit more dynamic range than the 7D. You can see that there's more area that's red here than in the picture of the 70D. And I don't know that I would put too much weight in that though, because I want to see how they recover, because I do this a lot in post. I'll either just drag the exposure down or I'll drag the highlights down. But for the sake of the comparison, I'll drag the exposure down here. And as we zoom in nice and tight to this overexposed area, we can see that, well, I dropped the exposure by more than 2 stops. So I recovered more than 2 stops of overexposure. And the detail level here looks great. I don't see anything lost in the overexposure. So this is the 7D's ability to recover the blown out highlights looks pretty good. And looking at the picture with the 70D, I've dropped the exposure exactly the same, and well, we see a few red spots here, but overall the detail seems to be about exactly the same. So I'm going to say you can overexpose these cameras by about 2 stops and you'll get pretty similar results. Let's take a look at the 5D Mark III's picture. You can see it has about the same amount of overexposure here. I'll drop this by the same amount. And we can see this looks about like the 70D did. So they're all able to recover a couple of stops of overexposure, and that's about it. I think if something's more than 2 stops overexposed, it's probably just lost, but you can keep that in mind as you're shooting. If there's a white bird, as long as you're shooting raw, you'll be able to recover a lot of the highlights. Let's quickly look at the 70D versus the 7 at ISO 25,600. Now the 70D natively supports this ISO, the 7 does not. So I had to shoot with the same shutter speed at ISO 12,800, the 7's top ISO, and then push the exposure in post-processing to get the same level of brightness. Let's zoom in to 100% here. And looking at the background noise, to my eye, I can't see any difference between the two cameras. Even though the 70D natively supports it and the 7 does not, it doesn't seem like you get any advantage even at the super high ISOs with the 70D. It just seems like the technology hasn't changed at all. They seem identical at all ISOs. So in summary, I disregard the image quality differences between the 70D and the 7. Let's take a look at the 70D versus the Mark III at 25,600. And here once again, the 70D just shows more detail because of the crop sensor and the higher megapixel density. However, as I would expect, the Mark III's larger individual sensors produce a much less noisy image. So the background here is much cleaner, as it's going to be at all ISOs. So in summary, the 5D Mark III has the best image quality if you can fill the frame. If you do shooting sports where you can get fairly close to the players and fill the frame with the lens that you have, or if you're doing setup photography and you can get those birds nice and close to you, go for the 5D Mark III, assuming you have the budget. If you live in the real world, like the rest of us, and you can't get that close to the players or the birds, you're probably better off getting one of the crop sensor cameras, the 7 or the 70D. But what you get, image quality isn't going to be a deciding factor for you. I just couldn't see any difference. Now let's talk about video. This is really exciting because a lot of people bought the 7D or the 5D Mark III and hope to shoot both stills and video because they're both widely reported as being great video cameras, but they can't focus when they're recording. So for wildlife or sports, that's not really usable. Athletes move around, animals move around, and your camera can't keep up with them. You can only really use them for static shots like this, where I'm standing in one place. And a lot of people ended up just frustrated when their camera wouldn't track the subject. The 70D, though, it really can track moving subjects while recording. And I previously recorded an entire video covering just the video capabilities of the 70D. And I tried it extensively with both sports and wildlife on a tripod and handheld. And the results were kind of mixed. First, for like shooting my daughter's soccer games and for other sports, it worked pretty well. It worked, you know, like every camcorder that you've ever had, except that you could put a really nice lens on it. I recommend the kit lens that came with it. I'm using the 18-135. It worked out great. I also tried it with my 70-200 f2.8, the Canon model, with and without a teleconverter, and both still shots and video worked beautifully. The focusing on the 70-200, even though it's not an STM, it did just great while recording video, and for the most part, it could keep up with moving subjects. Now, I had a real problem because with sports, sometimes a player will step in the foreground, and the focusing system would immediately latch onto that closer player. Now the 70D offers 3 different video focusing modes, and the one I ended up using the most was the Area AF without the face tracking. I really had high hopes for the face tracking, but what happened with sports is it kept latching onto the faces of people in the stands, bystanders. And then people would just be running by and all blurry. I had to turn that off, and I just ended up using the just general AF. Now, in theory, you could touch the screen to track the players, but that's pretty hard to do. I mean, I was using two hands to hold the camera, and while you're kind of watching the viewfinder, it's too much to do, basically. I think maybe if you had the camera set up on a tripod with a loose head, you could kind of follow it with just one hand and do it, but maybe I just need to become more coordinated as a videographer. I had to basically let the camera pick where to focus. And as we can see, it misfocused on a regular basis, but it still did a better job than any other DSLR out there in the Canon lineup anyway. So for video, I highly recommend it. So now let's talk about how it does for wildlife. For sports, you can use like medium telephoto lenses, like a 70-200 with or without a teleconverter. But for wildlife, you're really using 400 or 500 millimeter lenses, maybe even with a teleconverter. So you're dealing with much longer lenses. And I found the live view was really, really difficult to use for video, and I didn't have a lot of luck with it. I got some shots. I went down to the beach where there were tons of seagulls and just did my best to get them in focus. But I'll tell you what, it's a skill I'm gonna have to spend years developing probably. When you're holding the camera up to your eye and you're looking through the viewfinder, it's almost like looking down the barrel of a gun. Like you can train yourself to know exactly where it is, but you can't see the video through the viewfinder on the Canon SLRs. Instead, you have to use this live view display. And that means that you're kind of standing back from it and you're moving it like this. And somehow it's so much harder to track a subject like this when you're standing back than it is to have it up like that. I'll say that there's also a tiny, tiny bit of latency between the time that the light comes through your lens and hits a sensor and the time that it's displayed in the viewfinder, and this is true of any camera with a viewfinder. You can't beat just the speed of light of it bouncing off a mirror and hitting your eye. And that little bit of latency means that there's a little bit of lag between every movement you make in the camera and when it shows up. And these are things that all make video on any camera that uses an LCD like this difficult. The 70D also has a fatal flaw when it comes to video, and that's no headphone jack. And there's not even monitoring for the audio. At least if you could see the bars while you were recording, you would know that audio was still coming in and that the signal strength was okay, but you have nothing to go on when you're recording for audio. So I have no idea if the mic is working, if the sound is okay, if with my wireless mics, if there's interference. And so either you use an external audio recorder, like I sometimes do. I have a Zoom H4n, but then when you record it, you have to go back and sync it up. And it just takes extra time. It adds more to the workflow. I like to record directly into the mic. Okay, a couple more points that I want to mention about the video. First, I really like the articulating screen. This allowed me to hold it at like waist level, and that allowed me to hold it a little bit longer, because if you hold it out here in front of your face, which you're required to with the Mark III or the 7D, your arms get tired an awful lot faster. Holding it at waist level, I found I could just hand hold it for longer, and I just tilted the articulating screen up at myself. It also means that if you were in a crowd, you could hold it over your head and tilt the articulating screen down and still film what's going on okay. Another point about the video, if you do plan to shoot video of wildlife and that's your primary focus, I would actually recommend going for the Canon 100-400 f5.6 lens. For video, I think it would be terribly useful to be able to zoom back and find your subject in the viewfinder and then zoom in. Now the 70D can also autofocus while recording up to f11. So you can stack a teleconverter on a lens like this and still focus. But don't think that you're going to be doing that for shooting stills, because as I mentioned, it's terribly hard to use the live view and track moving subjects. So maybe you can do it if something is completely still and stick the teleconverter on there and use the autofocus system with the live view, but it's not really practical. So I basically completely dismiss this ability to autofocus to f11. I suppose if you are like paparazzi and you're setting up camera on a tripod with a telephoto lens at the hotel across the harbor in New York so you can spy on some celebrity at some distance, all right, stack on some teleconverters and get yourself to 1300 millimeters or something, and then be able to use the autofocus system. So maybe that'll work for you. But in practice, for wildlife, you're not gonna be able to track a moving subject with that kind of focal length anyway, so I'm not sure that it's all that practical, but that ability is there. It doesn't work when you're looking through the viewfinder. You're still limited to f5.6 autofocus when you're using the viewfinder. One of the challenges with doing camera reviews is that I'm one person. And I always team up with Chelsea and get her feedback too, but then that's still just two people and we all have different priorities, we have different budgets, we do slightly different things. So I went out with two award-winning wildlife photographers, my friend Christopher Rao and my other friend Kathy Cogswell, and I got their impressions of all three of these cameras, the 7, the 70D, and the 5D Mark III. And after we spent about 3.5, 4 hours together out there shooting, trading cameras, trading stories, talking about the cameras, I recorded their feelings on the beach.
Chris, what were your impressions of the 70D versus the other cameras you worked with?
Actually, I found one of the coolest things, which I didn't think was going to be that cool, was the touchscreen. Really simple. If you you take your picture, you hit play, you can instantly zoom in, which is a pretty nice feature. I'm sure that'll be coming to more and more cameras. I felt the 70D was actually a little bit better than it was going to be because I'm obviously a Nikon shooter. Switching over from a Nikon to a Canon, I have some issues with shutter placement and other various things. But overall, I thought it's a pretty solid feel. It's relatively quick and responsive. I tried it both with the 500 f4 and the 400 5.6. Seemed to track relatively well, lock on target, and produces great images.
What did you think, Kathy? What were your impressions of the new 70D?
I'm a 7D shooter, and I have small hands like a lot of women, and I found that the 70D was much nicer, lighter, and the grip, the horizontal grip was smaller, so it made it a lot more manageable for me. I had less problems with the fingers, and I also found with the prime lens, the 400 prime lens, along with the 70D was much lighter than my 7D with a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. The quality and the weight was much different, and I really like the lighter setup.
So, Chris, did we sell you on Canon? Are you switching over from Nikon?
No, I think I'm going to be sticking with my Nikon for now.
Oh, why?
Although the video features are nice, I still like my D300 as old as it is. It's very quick, it's responsive, the autofocus tracking is really excellent. I'm always a little surprised when I look at the LCD screen on the back of a Canon, though images always seem to look a little bit better. I think once you actually see them on a screen and you process them, I don't think there's a huge difference. And I know between the 7D and the D300 there's not a ton of difference with noise. Maybe if the 7D Mark II came out and the D400 maybe came out, I'd think about it.
What were your thoughts on using the video for the 7D?
The video is a pretty interesting implementation. I was pretty impressed with how quick the autofocus is. Again, on that touchscreen, we were kind of playing around with seagulls in the distance, and it's very responsive. But I find if you're going to be really trying to do a lot of wildlife, hardcore videography, it's going to be pretty tricky to get used to that screen and how quick they move. Like even seagulls taking off, the camera wasn't fully tracking going into flight. It would take a lot of practice and probably a faster lens.
Do you have any thoughts on whether people should, if they're in the Canon world already, whether they should go for the 70 or the 70D?
I think it depends a lot. I think it's kind of like I'm a pretty hardcore wildlife photographer, and my primary mission is pictures, stills. I feel I would personally go for the 7D still, not the 7DD, which I wish Canon had not done that naming. But if because with the 7D you do your occasional video. If you want more of a well-rounded camera that can do wildlife, that can do video, I'd say the 7DD is pretty hard to beat right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, Kathy, if you were buying fresh right now, with the gear that you played with today, what do you think you'd buy?
I'd be very tempted to look at the 70D, but with that 400 prime lens, just again because of the weight, and I don't shoot on a tripod, I shoot handheld, so I have to hold it up, so the weight for me is a significant issue, and then again with the small hands, it was just a much better feel. So kind of have to try both, but I really do like the 70D for those reasons.
Yeah, me too. All right, thanks guys.
A couple more minor points. The 70D has the level in the viewfinder, which I found terribly useful for both sports and wildlife, because one problem I have is I'll be so focused on the subject that my camera starts to like tilt to the side a little bit. And if you're shooting near the water, well, you'll see a bird and the horizon will be there and it'll be at like a 10 degree, 20 degree angle, and then you have to straighten it in post. I also really liked the touchscreen in the 70D. I didn't think I'd care about it. I completely dismissed it because I'm so trained to use the buttons, and the touchscreen interface is kind of clumsy. Like, it's a poor implementation of a touchscreen interface. If you've used an iPhone, you're gonna find it incredibly frustrating. But it's still way better than not having a touchscreen interface. And for wildlife specifically, I can hit the play button and then pull my fingers apart to zoom way in and see the details of a picture. Then I can just drag my finger to pan around it. Now, if you do that with a 7 or a 5D Mark III, then you're hitting that magnifier button a couple of times to zoom in, or you're racking the main dial on the Mark III, and then you're like panning around it with these menu things, and it just takes much, much longer. So on the 70D, you can review your pictures much faster, and I found that to be really helpful. All right, so let's sum this up by talking about cost and value and me providing my formal recommendations, which are going into the buying guide, which you can, just for now, get for free at SDP Community. That's like stunningdigitalphotographycommunity.com. Now, the 70D costs you about $1,200 new just for the body. I'm also going to recommend this 400mm f5.6 prime for those into wildlife. That runs you about $1,300 new. Or if you're doing sports, most sports, I'm going to push you to the Tamron 70 to 200. Either the one with or without IS, depending on your budget. The one without IS is about $760. The 70D costs you $1,200. The 70 new is about $1,340 body alone. But here's the catch. You can get the 7D used, and you can get it as low as, well, I saw one guy get it for $550 on eBay, really a working body, but the average sale is anywhere from $700 to $1,000. I bought this body used for $750 a few months back, and the prices are just continuing to drop. So if you don't mind buying used, and I highly encourage you to check it out, I buy all my gear used whenever I can. You don't have the option of buying the 70D used right now because it's brand new. And if you could, well, you'd be paying almost new prices. But this 7 is a little long in the tooth, and it's very capable. So in other words, it's, you know, a little more than half the price of the 70D right now. And for that reason, I'm going to make it my recommendation for wildlife photographers. I'm going to say, go out and get a used 7D, plan to pay around $750, use a little patience, use some sniping, go to Gixxon.com and set up an account, bid on a dozen different camera bodies, bid $750, and one of them is going to go through. As long as you wait a couple of weeks, you'll get that $750 body. Then try to find this 400mm 5.6 prime, not the zoom, and buy that with a target price of, say, $1,050. That's about what I paid for this one used. And that'll put you into an amazing professional level wildlife photography setup. You're looking at about $1,800, and I know that's not chump change, but you can get pro level results. You'll never be peering at your pictures thinking, why isn't that sharp? It'll be sharp. If you plan to use your camera for wildlife and a bunch of other stuff, then get the 70D. If you're not a dedicated wildlife shooter, or if it's your one camera body that's going to need to do everything, then get the 70D. The 70D is a better camera than the 7. It's just newer. It's got all these nice new features like the touchscreen. It's got this articulating screen that I love. It's got Wi-Fi, which is useful. And the video completely blows away the 7. So I'm a big fan of the 70D. And what about my 5D Mark III? I'm going to recommend the 5D Mark III for those, well, first you have to have the money, right? If you're shooting indoor sports, like basketball or volleyball, where you can get fairly close to the subject and it's in low light, then the 5D Mark III is going to make a big difference in your image quality, especially if you get a fast lens with it. The image quality on the 5D Mark III completely blows the others away, assuming you don't have to crop tight. If you have to crop, the crop bodies are still the way to go. This is not my last review of the 70D. I'm going to be making a complete overview of how to use the camera. So for those of you who've bought it, I'm going to show you exactly how to get the most out of it and how to set it up, including the basics of all the different controls. So if you want to see that, subscribe. If you like my style, if you like my videos, there's 6 hours of video in my book, Stunning Digital Photography, and I teach you how to do all types of photography, but especially wildlife photography. So check that out. You can use the links in the description below, or you can go to Amazon or just about any other store. The ebook is under $10. It's available in a paperback book too. Both have all the videos accessed online. So check it out, and also check out my buying guide at sdpcommunity.com. It's still in the draft stages. I'm getting feedback. I want to gather feedback from lots of other people on my opinions on different camera bodies and such, so it's not just my opinion, right? So check it out. If you disagree with something, please write me an email at tony@northrop.org. Please do check it out. Thanks so much.